Here we go. All right, so welcome everyone. Now we are officially starting our Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional Conference, COVID-19 micro panel, or micro summit. We are discussing school closures today, school closures and the equity gap, particularly the impact on Black and Brown students, particularly low-income, underserved, historically distressed student populations. All 50 states are going through some very unprecedented and historic school closures, all 50 states. There may be a few school districts here and there which haven't closed all their schools, but for the most part, school districts have shut down their facilities. Many school districts are also using online learning or some other unconventional strategies and methods. Some school districts have not adapted so well. We can pretty much say that school districts are still struggling as they're going through that, but that's exposed a number of gaps in terms of equity, in terms of a lot of social economic challenges that students deal with. So we're going to go ahead and start our panel. So for about 30 minutes, we're going to have a discussion between myself. I'm going to be throwing out questions to our esteemed group of panelists. And then a little bit later on, around 10:30, we'll field questions from the audience through the Zoom group chat. So people can raise their hand and also chat and send questions that way that you want to pose to the panelists. We appreciate everyone. We appreciate the panelists giving us their time, and we also appreciate everyone else who's been wanting to give us a little bit of their time this early Friday morning and is joining in and listening in as well. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists. Before we start, we have Connecticut State Representative Quentin Phipps. State Representative, can you hear us?
Good morning, everyone.
All right, good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. Also with the Center for American Progress, we have Khalilah Harris. Khalilah Harris, can you join us?
Good morning.
Hey, good morning. All right, Khalilah Harris is overseeing K-12 research, K-12 education research at the Center for American Progress. Also, we have Rashawn Biddle. Rashawn Biddle, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, excellent. Rashawn Biddle with Dropout Nation founder, chief editor of Dropout Nation, also a K-12 education expert as well. Gregory Holston, Reverend Gregory Holston. How are you doing, sir?
Good morning. Glad to be here.
All right. Good morning. Good morning. All right. Reverend Gregory Holston joins me as senior advisor to the district attorney of Philadelphia, also founder, former executive director of Power, nonprofit advocacy group in Philadelphia, also a former teacher as well, also joining us too. And also Debbie Paige. Debbie, are you there?
I'm here.
Debbie, I just want to give Debbie a real quick shout out. Debbie is senior policy analyst and also director of the Communities of Color effort that is out of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. And so she's done a fantastic, superb job kind of putting this all together. I don't know, real quick, Debbie, before we go on, I just wanted to make sure, is there anything that you wanted to say as far as what the Council of State Governments is doing with this Council on Communities of Color effort?
So thank you, Charles. So the Council on Communities of Color is a relatively new initiative at the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. And we are really looking at how public policy impacts people of color, districts of color, communities of color. We believe that all legislators, all state government have people of color living in it. So therefore, we need to focus, if as an example, if you have transportation issues, or if you have, as we're talking about today, education issues, oftentimes it impacts these communities at a more direct or adverse way. And we want to be able to bring people together to discuss these kinds of issues. So thanks for the opportunity to just kind of do a little talk about it.
All right, excellent. Also joining us as well is Michelle Crumpton-Harvey. Michelle Crumpton-Harvey is also Vice President of K-12 Expansion and Innovation. Michelle, I just want to make sure I get a mic check on you and make sure you're there.
Good morning, I'm here.
Okay, good morning. Okay, good. We got a mic check on you earlier, so I just want to make sure I'm viewing all this as it's all unfolding. Thank you, Michelle. And also an organizer of this convening is Martin Pratt. Martin Pratt is also a fellow with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. Martin, how are you doing?
Good, good.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much. And okay, let's go ahead and get started. So I'll start with you, State Representative. As you're watching these school closures unfold, got a wave of historic school closures happening. K through 12 schools also having that happen on the higher education level. But State Representative, I want to get your thoughts on one, how like your state of Connecticut is handling that. And you've got high concentrations of diverse Black and Brown students in that state as well, how it's handling it. Can school districts do any better? What have you been saying nationwide?
No, that's a great question. And so my day job is I'm a political director and director of advocacy and policy for the leading school district in the state of Connecticut, Stanford Excellence. 99% students of color, almost the #1 school district in the state. And I think what this crisis has really shown is that our social safety net does not exist. We are experiencing mass amounts of trauma throughout the entire community, and especially in the Black and Brown community. So it's really hard to talk about what school districts are doing and aren't doing without talking about the inherent trauma that we're all experiencing. So when we lead, so I think what the #1 thing I would ask folks to really look into and really think about and digest is the overall supremacy lens in which we are still trying to talk about education. The fact that we're prioritizing oftentimes distance learning and what are our children learning, and can we get the Chromebooks in their hands? And I think that really misses the point from the forest from the trees. And if we're not talking about the question that I was recently asked from one of our students who just said, Mr. Q, when are we going back? And I think that's such a loaded question of when we're going back. And I think he's asking, when am I going back to a place that I know is safe? When am I going back to a place where I know people continue to care about me? When am I going back to a place that's going to project me on the future that we've been talking about for 5 or 6 years? If we're not talking about that trauma and that underlying question, I think we're missing the point. So even as I look at some of the things that my school has done with distance learning, making sure that they have access to the internet and getting Chromebooks in their hands, all those things are great and are super, super important. Mm-hmm. But we really have to get away from looking at our children and our students as producers and as means of production, and start looking at the humanistic point that these are young folks and their families are experiencing mass amounts of pain, and we have to address the pain before we can continue to say that it's time to start thinking about the education.
Mm-hmm. Khalilah, I want you to jump in here, kind of give your thoughts, your assessment of how school districts have been handling these closures, and sort of expounding a bit on what the state representative is saying here in terms of how we perceive students, how we're perceiving these gaps. Khalilah?
Hello.
Hi there. All right, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I want you to you give your assessment of how things are unfolding nationwide, how the school districts are handling it, what you're hearing too.
Thanks, Charles. It's Khalilah, by the way.
Khalilah, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
All right.
All right. So, I want to piggyback on what was just said about the mindsets of our children and whether or not we have a safety net in this country. And frankly, unfortunately, what we've been seeing over time is that people have maybe focused too much on safety net as opposed to systems that move people out of poverty and into liberation and able to practice self-determination. So I think that's beyond the lack of any real structures that could support in a crisis like this. Really, those systems have profited off of the backs of people who for centuries have experienced trauma at the hands of our government, frankly. And what we see around the country are disparities between children in rural communities, children in highly concentrated communities of poverty, not having access to technology, but also we know that children have been put in a position where their passage may be contingent upon them completing work packets, which is really nonsensical. And we are pushing for an expansion of this concept of what should allow a child to be promoted from covering content instead to mastery of skills and a knowledge base that all of our young people need to succeed in life, to be able to go on to college and career, to practice as effective members of society. Instead, we see not only the trauma of children and families, but trauma of educators not really being taken into account, and the expectation that people that have really been doing a whole lot with a whole little are being asked to snap, turn around, and be emergency responders to provide a new type of instruction that they are also not familiar with to children and families. So it's very disparate. At the federal level, what we're seeing is a push for us to rapidly get out a fourth stimulus to address things like, the disparity in resources that pre-existed the pandemic. Also a push to eliminate the Secretary's ability to make waivers to IDEA and the Rehabilitation Act. So our students with special needs are being heavily impacted. We see some school districts where they have not resumed instruction because they don't want to violate students' rights under the IDEA. So instead of violating IEPs, no students are getting any type of instruction or enrichment. So there are a range of things that we need to pay attention to. And as we know, Black and Latinx children have been oversubscribed into special education. So we need to make sure we're paying attention to our students getting the supports they need, since they do have an IEP.
Michelle Crumpton-Harvey, you're out there in California overseeing innovation for and also expansion for Learn for Life. So I know you all experiment with or you implement trauma-informed models. Talk about that trauma piece that Khalilah was just mentioning just a moment ago. And when we think about trauma and also equity gaps, how are we defining that?
Yes, at Learn for Life, we use a trauma-informed model because a lot of the students who come to us, of course, they have challenges. So we want to make sure that we're using a whole child approach to helping children. It's like the representative said, it's not just an academic issue, it's a humanistic issue. We have to be aware that children are already coming to schools with issues and challenges, and our job as educators is to make sure that we look through a trauma-informed lens to be able to educate these kids, see what their needs are, how we can support them with wraparound services, but also another important issue that was mentioned by Ms. Harris is the staff. We need to make sure that our teachers are taking care of themselves, that they are prepared to be able to deal with some of the challenges that we're facing in the educational space today. So having trauma-informed practices across the board in education, it not only helps the students, it helps the adults. Here we serve about 50,000 students, and one thing that we are seeing with the equity gap is food insecurity with schools closed, making sure that we can get meals to students, technology, broadband access. We've handed out over 4,000 laptops. We are looking for to also match those with MiFi hotspots for kids, because the reality is you can hand out laptops all day long. The majority of children who are in disadvantaged communities or low-income communities don't have access to internet. So we have a host of issues that the COVID-19 crisis has brought to the surface that we as educators have been dealing with for years, and we knew were there.
Could Rashawn, I want you to jump in here. Could school districts have planned any better as far as this sort of crisis? And we always hear about that, particularly in our space, that institutions, agencies like schools are supposed to engage in constant disaster planning or continuity of operations planning. We're getting the sense that a lot of folks, if they were doing that, they're not rolling this out efficiently or effectively at all. But Rashawn, jump in here and talk about whether or not school districts could have planned this or could have even figured this out any better than they are right now.
Well, here it is. Here's the thing I would point out to folks that, there's been talk about online education for about 2 decades, and we've been working on this for 2 decades. And there have been a number of organizations that have done various forms of online learning, including virtual charter schools throughout the country. The evidence is that those things don't work really well. In fact, in Indiana, a report came out that said that students fell behind in virtual learning. And these are kids who are supposed to be, this is supposed to help them deal with a whole bunch of issues. And yet, despite all the work that has been done by those virtual programs, they're not effective. So if you look at it from the perspective of new startups and they're not able to do this well, imagine what a district is going to try to do. A school district whose first priority is, of course, education. But let's be real. Schools have become the safety net of last resort for poor and low-income children and marginalized youth. In many cases, especially if they're bullied, if your kids are bullied, if they're LGBTQ, if they are kids who have very difficult home lives, school is the safest place for them to be. And so the school district is trying to educate, and then they're trying to provide a safety net when they shouldn't be doing that safety net work. That's something that the federal and state and local governments should be doing, and they've been failing at this for 60 years now. Then you want to ask them, okay, do this, and then meanwhile they have to work with teachers unions who are going to be naturally skeptical about any new initiative, for one thing, because most school districts don't do technology well. That's real. And second part, because they're afraid of these efforts end up being used to replace teachers, which, as we're learning, you really cannot replace teachers in the learning process, whether it be online or in real time. And so school districts are trying to do the best they can. There was no way that they could do a whole bunch of disaster preparedness for this. There was no way that they could have done this without aid from the federal government. For example, we look at broadband. The issue in this country, I mean, you got places like Arkansas where only 79% of the people in that state have broadband access. We're talking about a whole large portion of rural communities that don't have broadband. So imagine if you're a rural school district and now you're asked to do online learning right now. You couldn't plan for that. You can't even do it. You can't do it now. You couldn't plan for it then unless the government actually went out there and greatly expanded broadband to every nook and cranny of the country, a thing that has been pushed by a whole bunch of people for the past 20 years and has not happened. And Congress has refused to do this. So when you think about all the various pieces that school districts would have to do to get this done, including dealing with IDEA, making sure that there's accommodations for our learning disabled students, making sure that physically disabled students are able to be accommodated, dealing with the fact that, okay, what if you have a child who's deaf, but they're deaf, and worst of all, they don't have a parent who can sign off for them to even do online learning. And in many cases, you have a large situation where school districts don't even have all the information and the contact data for parents, because some parents don't have emails. Some parents barely have telephones.
Let me do this, Rashawn. Yeah, some interesting thoughts. And Gregory, I want to bring you in on this conversation. Should school districts, because I know that in Philadelphia, for example, there are a lot of whispers about the school district deciding to, or the state deciding to have all school districts throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania just shut down. Let's just shut down for the rest of the year. Is that a smart move? You know, since school districts have had a very rough time, have had a struggle of trying to adapt to this new pandemic environment, should we just shut it down and just sort of reassess, regroup throughout the summer, come back at it in the fall?
Well, obviously, clearly that the lack of instruction for our children as it goes on week after week after week may be the kinds of levels of dislocation that they won't be able to get that back in terms of their own education, and that may cause a great deal of aggression. I believe we need to educate as quickly and as soon as in any way possible we can. But I think, as most people have said here, for particularly places like Philadelphia and other cities or towns in Pennsylvania that have school districts that have majority people of color, the level of inequity, this virus has shown the level of inequity across the board in almost every area. It's almost like been a scab taken off where you can clearly see the wounds of the inequity that is causing all of the issues that we're facing now. So, and at our own state funding, Philadelphia has had lacked $400 million a year, $400 million a year that it should receive in funding from a formula that was passed over 2 years ago that has not been enforced by the state. Other cities and towns are losing anywhere from 20 to 50 million simply because they're places of people of color. This has manifested itself in our buildings being toxic, where asbestos and mold and other diseases are in our own building, and our children were even crying out long before the pandemic happened that why am I in a school that has these kinds of issues, rusted pipes, mold, asbestos, and why am I being treated differently simply because of the color of my skin? And so all of these issues are now just being made manifest as the virus occurs because, yes, just like other districts, we can't instruct everybody because there's not equity. There are not enough laptops. There's not enough, the broadband, the levels around here where people fought to have what was called Comcast Essentials was a low-level broadband that was available and access to basically poor folk. But that level was such that you couldn't even be able to do the kinds of instructions that they want to do on. So we didn't have the laptops. We had internet that was not at the right level. We had to correct all of these things before we could even talk about doing any kind of remote learning where teachers could engage in students' lives. And so all of these things, again, just continue to show the inequity and the assault on our children. I think what was said earlier is very true. This is trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma that our children are facing, our young people are facing. And we need an immediate infusion of dollars that can go directly to our children to give them opportunities to be able to learn during this time period.
All right, if you're now joining us, folks are listening in, I may extend just by a few minutes this conversation because I do want to get into the solutions aspect of the discussion, but you're joining what we're actually hashtagging as CSG COVID-19, if you'd like to engage in a little bit of discourse or expand it beyond this Zoom panel on social media, primarily on Twitter, hashtag CSG COVID-19. This is the first installment of a series of conversations where we're exploring a number of issues that are relevant to Black and Brown communities as it relates to pandemic, this COVID-19 coronavirus crisis that we're in. Today, we're talking about school closures and the impact on Black and Brown students, how this has exposed some very severe equity gaps that were already there to begin with. So we brought we put together a fantastic group of thought leaders, of experts, of practitioners in the field of K through 12 education policy. We have state rep, real quick, I just want to go through this once again, particularly for, I've seen a number of people have just joined in. Connecticut State Representative Quentin Phipps is joining us. He's with the also, he's a part of the Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color, and want to thank them, by the way, too, for making this possible. Khalilah Harris is Managing Director of K through 12 Policy at the Center for American Progress. We also have Rashawn Biddle, Founder, Chief Editor of Dropout Nation, also K through 12 education expert. Michelle Crumpton-Harvey is VP of Expansion and Innovation at Learn for Life Schools in California. We also have Gregory Halston, who you just heard just a moment ago. He's the Senior Advisor to Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner, also a former teacher himself, longtime teacher, educator in Philadelphia, community advocate, former founder, executive director of a group called Power based in Philadelphia as well. I'm Charles Ellison, too. I'm a Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference fellow. Also, you know me as the executive producer, host of Reality Check on WURD, which is in Philadelphia, but you can stream it live at wordradio.com. Want to do a little bit of plug there. And that's every Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. And we're having a conversation about COVID-19 and the equity gaps that have been exposed by these historic, unprecedented school closures. State Representative, I want to go to you. Let's talk about solutions. What are some models that could be put in place during a time like this? And I mean, this does present us with a silver lining, right? That we're going through this because maybe this will force school districts to be a bit more agile and nimble and flexible to explore new innovative ways of educating, not just in situations like these, but also to tailor learning practices and curriculum for students who are in distressed circumstances, for more marginalized students. Representative?
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer that in two parts. One is I think the system part that Khalilah talked about, and then also that to your direct question. So if we're not talking about major systemic change around making sure that when you go to work, you have a salary and a compensation that you can provide for your family fully. If we're not talking about that, it's really hard to talk about education. If we're still having your health insurance tied directly to your employer, so when your employment leaves, then you have to be worried about how you're going to keep yourself and your family healthy. If we're not talking about that, it's very hard to talk about education. So we have to fundamentally change how our systems are in place in order to make sure that we have room to dynamically teach our children and our students. With that said, I think any school district that is looking at education on an individualized market, right? So using data on each individual child to make sure that their individual learning plan is designed for them so that they can move forward at their own pace. I think that's really going to be the way that we move forward. I think the giant classrooms of yesterday are not going to be sustainable moving forward. And the more that we start to use data to help children and also look at all the different particular models that can do well. I know for my own learning, having online learning was phenomenal in order for me to get my master's. But for the early education level, I think that takes a level of discipline that's very difficult for young students to do, especially if it's run by a for-profit model. But I think to the main point is that we have to look at each student as an individualized learner and using all the tools in the toolbox, whether it's the different types of pedagogy, whether it's the different learning environments, to move each individual student forward.
And Michelle, jump in here. Are those all the tools in that toolbox that the representative describes? Because a lot of folks, a lot of us are under the impression that the only way we can adapt to a situation like this or the only other alternative form of learning is that digital strategy or that digital tool, online learning. But what other tools are out there?
Yeah, there are other tools out there. There are teachers communicating with students through Google Hangouts, Google Classrooms. There are work-based packets that students can do. With technology today, you can have a video conference with a teacher, ask questions, look at math problems together. But one thing I do want to speak of, with COVID, there is an opportunity for education innovation, especially as we look at non-classroom based programs. Someone hit on this earlier about competency-based education. We have to get away from students going to school 5 days a week, 5 days a week, 7 hours a day, sitting in a seat, and that is determined to be, seat time is what we've been counting since the 19th century in America. We have to look at competency-based education, making sure that students achieve mastery of content, that they understand these subjects, that they acquire true knowledge. And we know that in the 21st century, that does not take coming into a building, as the representative said, sitting in a chair. Another educational innovation that I think this provides an opportunity for is that for decades, we have been opening different types of schools based on themes, models. It's now time for us to put aside any of the issues that we may have had surrounding charter schools, traditional schools. It's an opportunity for everyone to work together to bring best practices to the table, because those best practices are out here. It's looking, how do we reform an entire system? As we see, we couldn't even close workplaces because we were concerned about the kids. Once we closed the schools, then corporations were comfortable saying to parents, okay, now, you don't have to come to work. So COVID has really shown that our schools are not babysitting factories. They are not warehouses. We need to look at the entire system of education in America and realize that if it was built on an antiquated industrial model, that what we are doing now today does not fit for various reasons, be it school violence, pandemics. There are numerous reasons why a classroom-based model may not be what is best for a student. So I said, let's take this opportunity to look at all of these different innovations surrounding technology, non-classroom based programs, but technology provides an opportunity for teachers to be able to help their kids. It doesn't have to be an independent online experience absent of an educator. And I think that's where our professional development comes in, showing teachers how to work online, interact with students online, and make that rich and meaningful for students.
Khalilah, should students be confined to that, 7-8 hours a day, 5 days a week model? Are we seeing a major paradigm shift beginning that's been sort of presented to us or presented to school districts, educators, with pandemic, finding or figuring out a new way to learn?
Absolutely. So just had a conversation yesterday evening with some alumni from the U.S. Department of Education during the Obama administration. Secretary Duncan talked about the agricultural timeline of schooling, and that it probably makes more sense for us to no longer do that, and instead to have students having bigger breaks in the winter months when school, when it's really cold for them to be going outside, or when we have, as a result of climate change, really intense storms. I have been saying to folk that we need to think about architecting education as opposed to reconstructing what we had before. The fact of the matter is schools weren't working for Black and brown children pre-pandemic. And so going back to what we had before seems quite nonsensical, and we have an opportunity now. We heard earlier about getting kids back to school as soon as possible. The challenge I have with that is we really do need to pause and take a second to decide what we're bringing them back to. If they're back in school now and we just end the school year in June, parents will not have had money to pay for camps. Parents will still not be working. Children will still be at home. And that is not a sustainable situation. So I think we may want to consider, for those states who have said school is going to end for the rest of the year, no one's coming back, but we're going to make sure our staff is paid to use this technology to think through, beginning July perhaps, how we resume with a new calendar. We're going to come together with unions around their collective bargaining agreements, rethink about this idea of seat time, and the idea like they have 180 days, and if they do their 180 days and show up and they don't flunk, then good to go, they move on to the next grade. Grade level is quite arbitrary, and it doesn't connect to student developmental needs. And we really need to make this big paradigm shift. And I don't really want to couch that in innovation. It is in reality, per your show, it's in reality that we need to be doing school the way children learn and the way families work, and not just rush back into a structure that was not conducive for particularly the ways some students' cultural norms facilitate learning. Right? The traditional school day was not supportive of communities that use more storytelling or that use their native languages to be able to cultivate knowledge of the earth and knowledge of the world around them. So I would caution us not to go too quickly, but also to remember that even if schools are closed in June or at the end of May, children are not going to just all of a sudden start going on vacation in summer camp. So we have to we have to pull up 30,000, 50,000 feet to really think about this opportunity that I hope we never have again, but we have the opportunity right now to architect schooling that works for all children.
Do it much differently too. And I'm just being a little bit more cognizant of the time. It's a great discussion. I'm going to get some great feedback from folks. I'm seeing a few folks on social media. Just want to remind people, I'm going to start this in about a couple of minutes. I do want Rashawn and Gregory to jump in here real quick to talk about. I'm going to give you about a minute each. As far as those new models, Rashawn, stakeholders, who are the stakeholders here? Because Khalilah had just mentioned teachers. We've been mentioning them off and on. That's the natural reflex to sort of assume that only the teachers are the key stakeholders here, but then you got to consider parents, students, and there are some other folks out there, including policymakers. Rashawn, I'll give you about a minute, and Gregory, I'll have you jump in here, give you a minute each, and then we'll go to questions via chat. But Rashawn, who are those stakeholders that should be involved in this re-architecture of K-12 education?
Well, certainly you have to have parents. The reality is right now, one of the things that is coming up with when you start doing all this online education and all these parents being at home with their kids working on worksheets, it's a tough sled. I mean, and forget about the folks who are like me, who we're, husband, wife, we're both at home, we have resources, our kid is good. But what about the parents who are out there having to still work? They're still doing Instacart. They're still working at Amazon. There was an Instagram post with kids showing themselves going, wait a minute, I'm learning how to raise my brother. I'm learning how to do this, but they're not learning. And of course they're not learning. They're dealing with trauma and they're dealing with pain and they're dealing with parents who cannot support them. And so we need to look, as parents, it is our state governments, it is our welfare systems, it is the federal government. The federal government needs to spend at least $20 billion to do broadband to the last mile so that folks in the communities that aren't connected can get connected and so kids can learn. So guess what? If a kid is sick next year, he's learning. He doesn't have to take, there's no more snow days, there's no more sick days. You just learn and kids aren't missing school.
Gregory, who are those stakeholders? Rashawn laid out a good sort of almost complete list of them right there, but particularly in a city like Philadelphia, the largest city, the largest big city with the highest poverty rate. But who are those stakeholders in your mind?
Obviously, the faith community and community organizations, as well as parents, block leaders, block captains, all have to be engaged in the education of our children. It's very clear that for a long time, all the studies have shown that Black children achieving at the same level up until the third grade. Kindergarten, first grade, second grade, always more interactive learning, always more learning in which we are experiencing or learning of the environment around us and learning from the environment around us. Third grade, we start to put people in rows and stack them into classrooms and expect them to act and learn in a linear manner. And that is not how Black children learn. That's been clearly understood for a long, long time. So any new model has to really develop a way in which the school structure is organized that allows for that interactive, that creative, that engagement in the environment, in the community, that causes and creates in Black children and Black people the great creativity that has been established through music and industry all of the time, inventors all of the time when that's allowed to happen. And so we need stakeholders who will push for those kinds of things.
All right, I'm going to open it up to questions now. We've got about 20 good minutes, so I may go a little bit over here, but over 11, maybe go to 11:05. But I'm going to go ahead and field some questions from chat. Throw this out there to all the panelists. If you have a question, go into the Zoom group chat. The Zoom group chat, which is to the right of your screen. More than likely, it's to the right-hand side of your screen in this Zoom panel. Zoom group chat, submit a question, and I'll go ahead and ask those to the panelists or relay those to the panelists right now, and they can answer in real time. Panelists, anyone can jump in here on this. Some of these questions are directed at individual panelists, but other panelists can jump in as well. We have Tanji Reed Marshall, who is asking, Michelle Harvey, can she be more specific about what she means by trauma-informed strategies? How do the TIs differ from differentiation? I'm not sure what that last sentence means, but go ahead, Michelle, have at it.
Yes, differentiation is a different topic, but as far as the trauma-informed instruction, our company has been working with ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, to train teachers based upon the population of students that we serve. Our kids are 17 to 24 years old. They may be pregnant and parenting, foster youth, homeless. As I said, they come to us with a variety of challenges. And if you can imagine teachers day in, day out, helping students to navigate, where am I going to sleep tonight? What am I going to eat? My, baby brother is in the hospital and I need to watch 3 kids. The trauma that students experience has to be addressed in an educational setting. But there is professional development, research, and information that also shows that our teachers have to be shored up as far as trauma-informed instruction occurs, being knowledgeable about what are triggers for kids, understanding how to realize when a child has come into a space and is not having a great day, that there could be some huge mitigating issues around that. And I think we have to train teachers to recognize that. We have some really wonderful folk over at Learn for Life who are doing things on a national level with trauma-informed. And that's the innovation piece that I was speaking of, sharing these different practices that truly are best practices, but maybe existing in very small pockets, to be able to show each other what works, how do we take care of our teachers versus what is happening in the Philadelphia schools. It is about sharing best practices.
Got it. I don't know if anyone else wanted to jump in here. I can go on to our next question from Sabina Taj. Is there any effort to create a free tutoring service nonprofit? And Sabina saying that this is Betsy DeVos's dream come true. She has stated that she wants larger classrooms and fewer educators. This is going to be detrimental to students, as the single most important factor for student success is teacher experience and interaction. Anyone want to jump in on that?
Well, what I'll say is that what Betsy DeVos, well, let's ignore her for a second because she has nothing good or important to say. The reality is we have learned from 20 years of virtual and online education models that, if anything, the teacher interaction has to be even more intensive than in any the regular model in the classroom of 26 kids and 1 teacher. And that's because you're dealing with kids who are individuals. You're also dealing, especially with the younger grades like kindergarten, you're dealing with kids who have very small, very low attention spans. It's hard enough to get them corralled in a classroom in physical form, to get them on a Zoom conference. And I've done a few of these things with my 6-year-old. That is I completely understand how teachers had to deal with this every day. I mean, I understood before then, I really understand now. And so I think that what we're seeing now with some of the work that's being done by various organizations, from traditional school districts to charter schools, is that what you're seeing is teachers are out there actually making Zoom chats. They're out actually making phone calls. They're reaching out to kids and they're taking 10, 15 minutes of time each with these kids. And that's not going to change. In fact, it's going to be even harder to do that over time. Yeah. And the part that we really need to worry about is how do we do this in a way that doesn't burn teachers out even more? Yeah. Because the reality is, it's different. It's a difference between teaching a kid in a classroom with 26 kids and you get to stand up in front of them versus I got to make phone calls. Oh, by the way, I got my own kids in the background that I'm also homeschooling or helping to teach and having to do their homework. And I'm worried about my disease, about being sick. And I'm worried about my husband or my spouse or partner being sick.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Things too.
Yeah, exactly. We got another question this is a good question. This sort of goes back to that conversation regarding disaster response and Hurricane Katrina. Peter Groff asks us, New Orleans famously remade its entire education system after Hurricane Katrina. Does State Representative Phipps feel like this crisis will lead states to make transformative changes in their education models? Representative?
I would hope we would learn our lessons and not copy a lot of the mistakes and opportunities that we've done in New Orleans. And I say that as someone that works for a charter school. I think we've learned in that particular model that for-profit schools are completely out of the question. I think we've kind of led to the fact that online learning is probably not the best model for young students. I mean, I said I don't have children, but if I had to have my godson at 8 years old and sit him in front of a computer and say, you're gonna listen to someone that is all the way across town, I don't think that's a model that's going to work. What I would hope is that we are going to look at this current crisis and look at systemic change around what we're educating, what is the goal of education, but also looking at how do we reimagine our schools as not just a place that's a social safety net, where it's a place for safety and feeding and empowering, or as I think she had said before, about liberation. Like, how is this going to get you to the next step so that you can feel safe and secure in your own being as a member of your community?
Also, we have a question for Khalilah Harris from parent leader Gwen Samuel, who's president of the Connecticut Parents Union. Do you have any examples for parents related to your spot on question? We should be doing schools how kids learn. I think I have this question where I'm just reading it from the chat room, but Professor Harris, we want to jump in here about that, about examples for parents, how they can put pressure on schools. What sort of conversation should they be having with school districts?
So this is an ideal time for people who are interested in making sure decision-making is centered in community as opposed to at the policy level or grass tops, that the grassroots anchor communities, and we need to make sure we're working with them. When we think about certainly some charter school models that are African-centered and in tribal land, where we have indigenous communities reclaiming lost language, are examples of how parents have driven an interest in making sure students have learning and cultural responsiveness, cultural sustainability as a part of the day-to-day instruction. But what I don't want us to do is decide, like in New Orleans, that everybody should go to a charter school. We need to really come back, as Michelle said, and come together and think about what the right puzzle is for our own communities and make sure that all students have access to the quality of education that we expect our own students to have, our own children to have access to. I have 3 daughters and they are rocking and rolling on distance learning because it is not foreign to their school. You know, as Rashawn said, both parents have degrees. I have too many degrees in student loans. They'll be fine at my house. But that's not true for all students. And
Right.
We want to make sure that community has voice. We want to make sure also that whatever strategy we come up with is going to work for all children and not leave anyone marginalized or having to pick between moving or falsifying an address or using the wrong zip code just to get their kid access to what should be down the street for them.
Thank you, Khalilah. We also have a question from organizer Martin Pratt. This is to Gregory Holston. What does he think will happen with the Philadelphia school system utilizing this time to clean up the asbestos and lead in Philly schools, has been a constant conversation. You alluded to that earlier, Gregory. Or how could citizens of Philadelphia push a large board of education like that to use this downtime to clean dirty schools?
Absolutely, we should be pushing. Pushing mainly the governor, because again, the inadequacy of the funding from the state has been historic. He does have in his budget about $1 billion for school cleanup across the state around asbestos, mold, and other issues. 175 to 200 million of that is earmarked for Philadelphia. But this is an historic time. It does give us an opportunity to really look at buildings. Most of them that were built be near the turn of the last century, that were built in almost like warehouses where children learned and went right to the manufacturing plant down the street after they finished their schooling, after they graduated. That we need a whole new model and a whole new kinds of buildings that will allow for smaller type classes, interactive learning, the kind of learning in which engages students and allows them to explore opportunities that before them. And we need to take this opportunity to create that new model, not simply refit the old buildings and make them not toxic, but still not make them real places of learning.
All right. We also have a question from, and once again, panelists, feel free to jump in. I'm just going to extend this by maybe another 5 minutes or so. We haven't reached 11 a.m. yet, but we do have a question from State Senator Kevin Parker. State Senator Kevin Parker represents the senatorial district in New York State. He's also chair of the Council on Communities of Color at the Council on State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. And State Senator Kevin Parker asks, what are some specific legislative recommendations? Anything that anyone want to throw out there, especially State Representative Quentin Phipps? Obviously, this question is probably more within your wheelhouse, but feel free. I'd like for other folks to jump in.
Actually, if I can jump in on this one, it would be great if we at the state level saw advocacy around legislation that supports targeted resources being targeted towards communities that both face racial inequity and income inequity. Oftentimes people seek to conflate those two things. They are not the same. This is also an opportunity to address some racial disparities that we see in terms of resourcing how schools are funded. The other thing is advocating with your state legislatures and governor to make sure you will be able to see a stimulus that supports the needs of your community. When we think about things like how students are prepared for the future workforce, that needs to be a K-12 continuum as opposed to just high school. High school is too late to introduce students to advanced technology, advanced manufacturing. If parents and students had no idea about computing concepts in elementary school and in middle school. In my kids' middle school, computing and computer science is an additional literacy. It's not an option. So when we think about legislation, we want to also advocate for requirements that include community engagement and not at a surface level. There have to be accountability systems that incorporate community voice, that has fail-safes for those community members not being handpicked by government, but being grown from the community. So anything that you think you would want to see happen can be put into policy and legislation. And it's on, and oftentimes in Black and Brown communities, we participate in the policy process at the protest phase, which is at the very end, and oftentimes don't consider that we can write policy and ask people like Quentin to put that, put a bill before the state legislature to get what we want. The sky's the limit, and there's no limitation on what we can put into policy in support of our communities and children.
Yeah, before I go into the next question too, Representative Phipps, you wanted to throw in there any specific legislative recommendations?
Remind me never to follow after talking after her again. No, I would just probably reiterate a lot of the things that she said. I know in particular in Connecticut, really looking at our funding formula, right now it is more of a political document. I wanted to follow the child. I want it to be about student need and not about districts and politics. And I want our schools to be funded more about using a neighborhood school model.
Yeah. I
think so often our children have been shipped all the way across town or multiple towns in many cases to be at the best school. I want our schools to be social, economic, and political engines in their own neighborhoods, and figure out ways that we can empower that model versus the sort of magnet school model that we've done for so long.
Interesting, interesting. I also have a question from Liana, who is asking, is there any experience in specific states with teachers' unions engaging around the reframing and reimagining of the educational models that we've been discussing? Are there already successful partnerships that are in play?
Before we go down the path of the teachers union, back to the last question surrounding legislation and policy, I just wanted to quickly say there are numerous states right now looking at competency-based education, trying to put those tenets of what CBE is into legislation in various states, because we are realizing that this is not a temporary issue. If you look at the news, you realize that they're talking about a surge of COVID-19 again in the fall, the same time that we are talking about reassigning students back into school. So we definitely have to look at mastery, learning, and being able to document those things at the state level through accountability models to show how children are moving forward with competency-based education. It truly is the wave of the future. It does not require a classroom. It requires knowledge and assessment on various different levels. So we have to look at, as our policymakers and legislators, competency-based education from a state level, not individual school districts and buildings that are doing that. It is a way to help with some of these issues we are going to face in the future.
Anyone else want to jump in there?
Can I hop in here? Sorry, this is Subira Gordon. I joined a little late.
All right, go ahead.
So I think I want to go back a little bit to kind of what kind of public policy things we can be doing as we look forward. If we think about what students are experiencing this year, going into what might quote unquote be the traditional school year next year, I think there needs to be an across the board idea of assessment, not necessarily a standardized test where, you know, kids are doing a standardized test, but there needs to be some sort of a way to measure where kids are going into next year so we can avoid a couple things. Social promotion, we don't want kids to be being promoted just because of what happened with COVID-19. So we want to think about how are we going to institute either summer learning or different things in the beginning of the next school year to ensure that everyone is making sure that they're at the appropriate grade level or mastery level. And I definitely appreciate the comment about competency-based learning. If it's one thing that we should take away from this is a standardized model for education doesn't work. Specifically doesn't work when we're thinking about our traditionally marginalized communities. English language learner students are struggling right now. Students with special needs are struggling right now with all of this transition. So I just want to make sure that whatever we do moving forward, we are thinking about the individual needs of students, but we need to create something where high resource districts aren't necessarily being able to ace whatever it is, and our lower resource districts are struggling as we're seeing what's happening. There's been technology rollouts, lower resource districts, it's gonna take weeks to months to get the technology to the students. But higher resource districts have 1-to-1 ratio with computers or iPads going day one, so they're able to transition into distance learning that way. So I really appreciate all the comments, and again, I apologize, I was late, and I look forward to hearing.
No, that's all right, Subira. Thanks so much for the question. If anyone wants to jump in on that, I've got another question too from Tanji Reed Marshall, who wanted to jump in on that question or that comment.
I would just say maybe not so much just around the policy issue. I think one of the main things we have to do is really not just talk about how we create a new education system coming out of this, but what kind of world are we trying to create? You can't create an education system that's not attached to this world. And there is a new world coming. This technology that is maybe for the first time in history that is actually taking jobs instead of creating more new jobs is creating less jobs. The whole trucking industry might be completely destroyed just because they now have self-guiding trucks. And so millions of people may be permanently dislocated because of not only just the virus, but these changes. What kind of world are we going to be creating? What kind of work are we creating? What is going to be work in the 21st century? I think all these kinds of questions we really have to think about as we're shaping a new education system.
Yes, and I would go take it further, that, getting even beyond the world, we got to talk about the reality that the long-term discussion that has to happen. We talk about school systems. We talk about school systems spend $500, $600 billion a year. What we fail to consider is that 10% of those dollars are coming from the federal government. Another 20 to 30% come from state governments, depending on various distributions. But that means the remaining 60 to 70% of school funding is coming from local communities. And we are asking for school districts with low tax bases to do the same work with fewer resources than the districts who have the money to do this. And we need to ultimately require and demand that states take over full funding of their education systems. This was a push since the 2000s. One of the reasons why, whatever you feel about the No Child Left Behind Act, one of the reasons why it was passed was to finally remind states that it was their responsibility to make sure that the school districts that they are in charge of, the state constitutions say that they are responsible for, should be managing the situation and handling the situation in their states. Well, that's great, but you ultimately still have to take the money, because money is how you force change. And if you want a more equitable situation and want equity for all of our children, we have to have states take charge of that at the end of the day. And this is a good opportunity as any to start talking about doing that. Yes, we're in a recession, but we're always in a recession. There's never a good time to ever talk about these things. Well, guess what? You do what you got to do, and we have to do it now.
If I could jump in on that really quickly from a policy matter, the San Antonio School District versus Rodriguez is a case everybody should be familiar with. Mm-hmm. And it allows for zip code to be used for that taxes be distributed by zip code for schools. That has to stop immediately. And the conservative court of the Powell Court decided that if there was a class that was being, whose rights were violated, that income was not an appropriate class, but if one of the other suspect classes, race perhaps, was shown to be disparately impacted by using taxes by zip code, then it would be unconstitutional. Where here we are decades later, and we know that there's a racial disparate impact. There's a $1,500 per pupil difference spent on schools that are predominantly white versus non-white, a $23 billion annual gap.
Yes.
We need to stop using zip code and taxes by zip code to fund schools. Not just that the state should take over the funding model, but it is unconstitutional that people are able to create whole new communities and secede from a school district, taking resources with them because they're allowed to use their property tax just for their children. And it's difficult, and we're going to fight through it because people want what's best for their child. They do want to contribute to other kids, but don't take what's theirs. There is no pie. We have the resources. No one is going to go without if we cease using property tax as the main mechanism to fund schools by zip code instead of across the board.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and just give us a couple more minutes if any of the other panelists wanted to jump in on that question. Also, someone had a question about reentry, what reentry looks like. Maybe if anybody wants to jump in on that, Michelle or even Gregory.
I would just say quickly about what was just said. I would love to be able to agree with the state now having the authority to be able to make sure funding was done across the board. I would love to be able to agree to that, except I got some races in the center of Pennsylvania that I would not want to have to make the decision, that kind of decision-making power over all of the dollars regarding the lives of Black and brown children in the city of Philadelphia. And so that almost exacerbates the racial context that we are living in. And so I would just say, just be mindful that when we're asking for states to take over these things, that there are some rural areas that seem to dominate many of these states that do not and will tell you straight to your face, do not want to fund those children.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I think it's a real issue. Unfortunately, the problem you're going to have is that they do it now, and and we are still, and our communities still end up bearing the brunt of the whole situation.
That's just it. Them being allowed to do it by zip code is what allows for them to say, we don't have to give you money over there because you're in a different zip code and we're using your tax base. So if you don't have it in your tax base, you need to figure it out and pull yourself up by the bootstraps. So I agree with you to the extent that there needs to be guardrails put in place so that it's not a matter of we get to decide that it goes here or go there. There needs to be a formula. There needs to be community oversight, and there need to be systems in place so that the legislature is representing its jurisdiction.
Thank you. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, panelists. That ends it there. That ends our first installment of a series of conversations on COVID-19 and the equity gap. This is being presented, powered by the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. For more information on them, go to csg-erc.org. Also look specifically for this being presented specifically by the Council on Communities of Color, of which State Senator Kevin Parker from New York, who is, I understand, is in this Zoom micro summit or Zoom panel. He is the chair. Debbie Paige is senior director, senior policy analyst at CSG East, as we call it. I'm Charles Ellison, by the way, CSG fellow, and also moderator of this panel, of this micro summit. Martin Pratt is also a CSG fellow as well. He's been hanging in there with us and also as a co-host of this Zoom panel. Want to thank our panelists. We've had State Representative Quentin Phipps representing Connecticut's 100th legislative district. Also, Khalilah Harris. Khalilah Harris is managing director of K-12 policy at the Center for American Progress. Go to americanprogress.org for more information there. Also, Rashawn Biddle. Rashawn Biddle is founder, director, chief editor of Dropout Nation. Go to dropoutnation.net or rashawnbiddle.org for more information on that. Michelle Crumpton-Harvey is vice president of expansion and innovation at Learn for Life Schools. Go to learnforlife.org for more information on them and what they're doing out in California and a few other states as well. Gregory Halston's also been joining us at the last minute. He actually came in and stood in for Councilwoman Helen Gim, Councilwoman at large in Philly. She does apologize for being unable to join the panel. She had a very sudden last minute commitment, but Gregory Halston stepped in, senior advisor to Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner, also a longtime educator himself, former teacher, also offering us some great insights here today. Once again, I'm Charles Ellison. I've been your moderator for this discussion. Hashtag CSG COVID-19 for more on Twitter. You can also catch me at Ellison Report on Twitter, or just listen in. Go to WURD Radio, wordradio.com every Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to listen to Reality Check. And some of you panelists have been on the program. I appreciate that. I want to also send a big thank you and shout out to all of the participants, folks who joined in, who asked questions through Zoom group chat. I'm going to figure out some way to make those questions and those comments available in a public space or public forum, because there's some great questions and some great comments from our participants. And also folks like Subira Gordon, who jumped in at the last minute with a question as well via video. So really appreciate that. Appreciate everyone taking time out of their Friday morning. I want everyone to stay healthy, stay safe. Please follow stay-at-home instructions by your state and local government so we can all get through this pandemic together. Have a fantastic weekend, and we will join you for the next CSG East Micro Summit. It'll be coming up soon. Look out for that announcement.
Take care.
Thank you.